Hello, my name's Richard Chase and welcome to myself and Simon Arrowsmith's second online event. Our first event, which many of you attended, was just a couple of weeks ago, and we're thrilled to say that one of our keynote speakers, Gary Bertwistle, which I know many of you enjoyed, has very kindly offered us an hour and a half of his time. So welcome to those of you that attended Interconnect. Welcome to the new delegates that are joining us, and over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Richard. Hello, everyone. It's good to be back. My name is Simon Arrowsmith, here at Mission Control in the UK. Okay, so today I'm really pleased to say that today we've got again another international gathering of people. Some people from. Let's have a look and see where we've got people from. We've got people from the UK, Germany, Australia, South Africa, Portugal, Denmark, Ireland, Ukraine, Serbia, Azerbaijan, the United Arab Emirates and Turkey, amongst others. So welcome everybody, exciting times. So you might have joined us for our first Interconnect a couple of weeks ago, and one of our speakers there, Gary Bertwistle, went over really well, and we thought we'd invite him back to do not so much a deep dive on what he talked about last time, but to bring up a new subject. It kind of builds on what we were exploring last time, and this subject of the pandemic and what to do with your mojo. So, it stole my mojo. The pandemic stole my mojo. What do I do now? It's an interesting one. I don't know how you've been feeling, but I certainly have been feeling, let's say, not mojo less, but kind of mojo wobbly. It's been a tough 4 months, hasn't it? It's been a very strange 4 months, and there've been kind of, excuse the pun, but waves of difference around. To begin with, it was all about fear for me anyway. I was confused. I was a bit scared. I wasn't sure what was happening. Maybe a bit of shock in those first few weeks. Then there was this period of scrambling, I guess I'd call it, about what's my place in the world? What do people need? What's my work going to be about? Then I think there was this period of confusion where I just started to question myself. And I think what's been, I'll call it interesting. I'm not sure how interesting it is, but this isolation that we've all had and all been through, even though we've been doing this kind of thing and working remotely and working through video, it still felt quite isolating. And I found that isolation has led to quite a bit of doubt, too much alone time, too much time to think, too much time in my own head. And that hasn't really helped me, I think. My network helped. That was really positive. I've got a good network, a strong network that's been there for me. And this has been really positive out of it. Richard and I started the conversation about, okay, well, what can we do to maybe change direction? Maybe think about these things differently and think about the way we run events and the way we connect to audiences in new ways. And that's exciting. But I think there's still, so whilst I feel like I might have come out of this mojo wobble, I'm not entirely sure. Things do feel different for me. And as we're in this last phase, certainly here in the UK, coming out of the last phase where we're now, pubs are open, shops are open, life is returning very much to some kind of normality, I'm still left with this strange feeling. It's almost like I'm now mourning the lockdown. Oh my God, I wish I could stay safe in my little lockdown bubble. Maybe, I don't know. It's very, very weird. So the timing of this talk for me, I think is really positive, because my mojo has been like that, and I'm really, really interested to hear what Gary has to say about how we can get back into our more positive mindsets and address some of this stuff. Today, it's really the Gary show, so I'll be handing over to him in a second. I'll have a quick chat and hand over. But we want to get your questions. We want you to engage with Gary throughout. So I'll be moderating and I'll be watching on this monitor over here for your questions. So please keep them coming, and we will stop at, say, periodic intervals throughout, and I'll throw those questions over to Gary and we'll have a conversation. Last time we couldn't catch up with the number of questions. We still owe some of you answers. I'm aware of that. But today we're going to answer them live and on the go. So don't save your questions to the end. Keep them coming. Respond to what you hear Gary saying, and we will put the questions to him. So I'm going to bring Gary on now. Let's see. Hey Gary, how you doing?
Doing great. It's a real privilege to be here.
Excellent. It's good to see you all the way down there in Australia. Move
Yes,
slightly to your left, I think, a little bit for this one, because I've got you on a. That's it. Perfect. Yeah, that's it. Because I've got you on a two-way camera with me. So I was just explaining the fact that to our many people that this is a global event. America hasn't quite woken up yet, but they'll see it later. But we've got lots of people from Europe, from the Middle East. We've got people from Africa. We've got people from Australasia. So it's good stuff. And I was just saying that I feel like my Mojo has been on a bit of a wobble journey. Is this something you're hearing a lot from your clients and people you come into contact with?
Yes, it is. And I think because this is such a global audience, I'll just take 60 seconds to frame me and what I do and where I am. Right now, I'm coming to you from my property, which is in central New South Wales here in Australia, as you can tell by the accent. And I live on a farm and I run a little beef business as part of it, but it's also a place where I get to do a lot of my thinking. And it was always my dream is to have land and cattle and horses and quiet and a tractor. And I spend my time between doing these sorts of gigs now virtually and or live keynote events or working with people one-to-one. But I spend a lot of my time thinking about what's going on in the world and how I can take those learnings to share with people. And what's really interesting with what you just said, Simon, is yes, we are in a place where a lot of people feel as though they're losing their mojo. But what's ironic about what you said is you're spending too much time in your head. And the first thing we need to think about with this whole pandemic is it's actually not a bad thing to spend time inside your head. The question is, what are you thinking about? Martin Luther King said the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at time of discomfort and controversy. And this period right now has been a real test for us. Being in your own mind is actually not a bad thing. The question is, what are you focused on? And we can only control the controllables. The challenge has been that when you do an audit of your thinking during that time of being in your own head is, well, what are you actually focused on? And do you have any control over what you're focused on? And is that empowering for you? And what I'm finding now with people is you need to have a conversation either with yourself or with others to work out, well, what am I kind of focused on right now? Am I focused on the wrong things? Am I focused on the politics of what's going on or the leadership of what's going on or what someone's told me on the street or the different opinions coming through on social media? Well, the question is, with all that stuff, is any of that stuff that you can control? Because what was funny, Simon, is when the whole pandemic thing first started, everybody freaked out because they had to spend time alone. They had to spend time. They needed someone to distract them, to give them something to do. And if there's anything I'd say out of the gate for us with getting your mojo back for the pandemic is to do an audit of your head to say, what am I focused on? Am I focused on the right things? For example, if we're focused on we're not being as productive or we're not contributing as much as we'd like to, we're going through this roller coaster you talked about. The best tip is to break it down into the smallest possible pieces of things that you can control. And people might be, let's take something like exercising. And we've put exercising off for the moment because of the pandemic. We're too worried. We feel as though we've lost our mojo, so we're not exercising. And we're sleeping in too much. If you break getting out of bed down to the smallest possible pieces that you can control, the first thing is in the morning, set your alarm on the opposite side of the room. So when it goes off, it's going to drive you mad and you're going to get out of bed. And you're probably going to go back to bed. We'll set 2 alarms. If that's too hard for you, break it right down to when the alarm goes off, open your eyes. You can do that, can't you? You got enough energy for that. Break it right down to the smallest possible pieces. Then pull back the covers. That's the second step. Then sit up in bed. And so when you break anything you're going through, whether it be wanting to communicate with somebody, something for work, exercising, eating better, break it down to the smallest possible pieces first. That is all informed by, well, what am I focused on? Am I focused on things that I can't do now? Or am I focused on things that I can do now and working out how I can step towards them? And when I work with people one-to-one, quite often you can hear it in their language of where their focus is. And if you have the opportunity to speak to someone else to help them who's lost their mojo, by having a conversation with them and asking a lot of questions, you can hear in their voice where their focus is. And when you can readdress the focus of what they're thinking about, then you can break it down to, great, what's the first step for you? Don't focus on the big act, focus on the very first step. And it's really interesting, Simon, in knowing I was going to be talking to you and people from all over the world today, I wanted to share a fascinating conversation that I had with a lady who I think sums up where we are with this moving feast of the pandemic. So this is Dr. Terry Walls, W-A-H-A-L, Dr. Terry Walls. Now, this is a lady who, when she was in medical school studying to be a professor of medicine, she started getting electrical jolts in her face. Like she said, it was like a hot cattle prod in her face. And it progressively got worse and worse until she was diagnosed with progressive multiple sclerosis. And it got so debilitating as she studied and became a professor. She ended up in a wheelchair, and she was in a wheelchair for 4 years. And she started to break down traditional medicine, the usual treatments weren't working and she was getting worse. So she took matters into her own hands to say, what if I took control, break it down into what can I control, what I put into my body and my thinking. And she started to change her whole diet and her thinking based on what you can now find online at Dr. Wall's website called the Walls Protocol. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of eating. So what happened is Terry changed all that, went against traditional medicine, and she started to feel better. And she went from 4 years in a wheelchair to being someone who could walk with a walking stick. And then one day she went to her wife, Jackie, and said, I think I'd like to ride my bike again. And she hadn't ridden her bike in 5 or 6 years. So she went out to the shed, they pulled out her bike, her son rearranged the seat so she could get on it, and she went out to the street. Jackie was behind her, son Zach to one side, her daughter the other side, and she said, I pushed off and I rode my bike. And she said, I hadn't done it in 5 or 6 years. And she said, I just did a block. She said, I came back, I put my foot on the curb, and I said to her, Jackie supported you through this whole time of progressive multiple sclerosis. When you walked to Jackie, what did that moment mean? And she said, Gary, I went from living day to day to having a vision for the future. And I reckon that, Simon, is one of the issues. And as soon as I heard her say that, I thought, that's what we're going through right now, is a lot of us are having to live day to day just to keep our companies alive. We have to live day to day just to keep our staff employed. We have to live day to day just to get ourselves through this. There's some hardships. There has to come a point where you put a foot on the curb and go, what does the future look like? Because without a compelling future, we start to lose our mojo. And at that particular day, Dr. Walls decided that her dream for the future was to create an epidemic of health. And to me, I think we've all got to make that decision. Is that, are we living day to day, which is what you've been doing? And what's really curious, and folks, I had permission to do this with Simon and Richard, is that even going back 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, you guys were still in a day-to-day thing about can't do live events, can't do it anymore, until you went, well, if I didn't do it live, what if I did it virtual? And here you are tonight with people from South Africa, Portugal, Serbia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan. It's insane. But suddenly you found a dream for the future. And as we were talking about before we started recording, you can see now that future So you've gone from living day to day this is a stepping stone to the possibilities of what Interconnect could become. And I think there's got to be that tipping point where we move from day to day in order to get our mojo back. And the thing is with the pandemic, it's not the pandemic itself that's lost our mojo. It's what we've done about it. Now, the Buddha said, the first arrow you can't control, but the second arrow, that's your choice. Or as Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, said, there is a gap, a small gap between the stimulus and the response. The stimulus was the pandemic, hardships at work, impact on our loved ones, impact on our friends, a lockdown, whatever it may be. That was the first thing. But what we have got the opportunity to do is in that gap is what do we do between the stimulus and the response? And that's where being inside your own head is actually really valuable, because that's the second arrow. That little bit in there where you do the audit to say, why am I thinking about that? What can I control? I can't control the lockdown, but what I can control is my thinking, my habits, my rituals, my time to start dreaming of the future. And the future's going to change as we go, because we know even from the last couple of days around the world, rules, regulations, what's happened, the second wave, we can't control that. What we can control is ourselves. And what we've got to think about is it's something Marie Konnikova, who's an international poker player and psychologist, who's got a new book that came out a couple of weeks ago called The Biggest Bluff. Now, Maria came from Russia and moved to America. When she got to America, her parents said, we're not going to have a television set in the household because of the propaganda that was coming between the Soviet and being in America. So we're not going to have a television set. So instead, her dad read her stories every night by the guy, Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes. And Maria has since written a book called Mastermind about Sherlock Holmes. And I said to her, where did that come from? What impact did it have where your parents read you books every day instead of watching television? She said, Gary, my first instinct when I'm bored is to grab a book. And I thought, man, that is just so beautiful. What if our first instinct when you're inside your own mind was to sit down with a journal and write stories? Or the first instinct when you were bored and you had time to yourself was to sit and call somebody and say, hey, man, how you doing? Just checking in. What if your first instinct, rather than go for socials, what if your first instinct, rather than get inside your own mind, think about the things you can't control, what if your first instinct is, well, before I have that second arrow go, what can I control in here? What are the things that I've got control over? If I break it down to the smallest step, what could I do? I could go for a walk. Smallest step, stand up, put your walking shoes on. You might not even go out for you might not even go for a walk yet, but just put your walking shoes on. Next step, walk to the door. You might not even go for a walk yet, but just get to the door. So I think these things all sit in there, and it's all inferred by that being inside my own head is not a bad thing, because most leaders are yearning for some thinking time. It's been forced upon us. The question is, what are we focused on? Are we controlling the controllables? And there comes a time when you've got to go from day to day to start thinking about what does that future look like for me, my family, my contribution to society, the company, because we know we talked about this, with which we know that things are going to be different. Even doing this tonight with people from Turkey, the UK, Sim up there in Manchester, Tom in Melbourne, these things couldn't have been possible had it not been forced upon us. But it's taking those small steps to have a greater vision, which you guys have got. So we know things are going to be different, but anybody can do it in the good times. The real resilience and grit that we need comes from challenging how we see things right now. So I know I got a bit personal with you and I threw it back to you, mate, but I thought it was such an interesting insight that you dropped. It was too good an opportunity to miss. Do you want to throw to a couple of questions from people or things you've
Yeah, no, I just to respond to what you're saying, I think it's really interesting. How do you think? Please do put your questions in the question section to the I don't know where I am, left, over that way. Hopefully over that way. because I don't know where I am in relation to the questions. But my question, I guess, from my response to that, the thinking about that is, how do you balance this idea of, we know that the being present and in the moment is really important. How do we balance that being present and here for today, and like you said, but also that eye on the future? I think you kind of already addressed it with this idea between the first and the second arrow. But what are your thoughts on how we balance presence with focus on the future, and those two things at the same time?
So you've got to know the peak you're climbing for. And you've got to be able to crystallize that in your own mind and visualize what it is you want. And you don't visualize something you think you can do. You visualize what do you actually want to happen, because sometimes we don't know what we're capable of. But once you've done that, you can't live out in that period. You've got to come back to, in this moment, what's the very first step. That's why breaking it down is, you may say, you know what, I'm going to run the London Marathon. I'm going to run the Paris Marathon. Great. 42.2 kilometers, 24.2 miles, whatever it may be. That's the dream. You can see yourself crossing the line. You can see yourself doing all that, getting the medal, going for a lovely big ice cream after you've done the celebration, hugs, tears, the whole thing, right? It's wonderful. But if you spend your whole time thinking about that and you don't do the work, you're in for a world of pain. So if you've got that dream, you then got to go back and re-engineer it to say, well, what can I control right now is gonna need a good pair of shoes. I probably need a program, maybe someone to run with, and you run to the letterbox and back. That's how it starts. Just run to the letterbox.
Yeah, I think.
Then run to the telephone pole. Then do a block.
No, I agree, and I think one of the biggest challenges that I have is a lack of, let's call it a lack of patience. So I have a dream. I want the dream now. I can't wait for a year. I can't wait for 6 months. I need the dream now. How do we make sure that we can sustain the dream whilst keeping ourselves, locked into where we are and focused on the present, do you think?
It's funny because we're conditioned to always want the next thing. And anybody who is in business will know that if we're working in a sales team or a company and we go, here we are, the middle of July, we've smashed budget, fantastic. The first question the boss says is, how's August looking? So we immediately go, well, that's all good, but let's go on to the next thing. What we should be doing is going and sitting down with our journal or our loved one and going, I got the letterbox done. I actually did it. Good on me. I actually went there. And we should journal about it and be grateful for the fact that I did the letterbox and back. Tomorrow, I can visualize that telephone pole. I could walk it. I'm going to run it. That's fine. But we don't reward ourselves for the steps along the way. And we're not, and one of the issues which we will talk about before we finish today is gratitude, is that we're always looking for the next thing. But we know that people who are losing their mojo, who even go to the point of being depressed or having anxiety, one of the greatest things you can do is to be grateful for what you've got. Me tonight, hearing the people we have from around the world, I can't tell you how grateful I am for you guys setting it up and for those people giving of their time and attention. It's amazing. It's a gratitude of the smallest things, but we tend to look for the big thing. And the other thing I'd say to you, which is an issue in business and in life today, and particularly with this pandemic period, is we focus on the outcome, not the process. We compare ourselves to people, we compare ourselves to others, and we go, oh, they're really good. Look at our socials, look how beautiful they are, and their holiday, their car, their life, they all look great. Because they only take good shots when they look good. They don't take shots when they look crap. So we compare ourselves with them, but we compare ourselves to what they look like. We don't compare ourselves to actually the process of getting it done. We're in a big comparison thing of the outcome of what people have done. Well, we don't focus on the process. And the process is breaking down the smallest piece, the smallest possible piece, and then getting momentum. Now, Chris McChesney, who wrote The 4 Disciplines of Execution, said the best way to motivate yourself or others is to find small wins. So if you've gone the letterbox, or you've gone around the block, or you've run your first 10K, or you've entered in a race and you finish, even if you finish the race, finding a win is the most important thing. And if you're with kids, people at work, motivation, you can't motivate somebody, but you can make them feel awfully good about what they're doing if you find the small wins and acknowledge them.
I was interesting because one of the I had some questions which I'll ask you throughout. But one question that someone who couldn't join today because they're in the US, so they're asleep right now, was exactly that, about how do we tackle this issue of comparison. You know, my mojo is bigger than yours, kind of thing. Sue, she's saying, and also I think your point about the image and the story we're told through social media, through the broadcast that we all have, or connections we all have access to now, is filtered. It absolutely is filtered. Do you have any other, before you sort of carry on, any other tips on the comparison issue how to address it?
Well, it goes back to control the controllables. And if I was working with you or somebody specifically, which I do, I got about a dozen people I work with specifically on this. My first question is, what's the dream? If you knew you couldn't fail, or a better question is, even if you knew you could fail, but you still wanted to have a crack at it, tell me the dream, unfiltered. Just what do you want for your life? Family, what do you want? Draw me the picture. Not just a nice statement, but draw me a picture, tell me all about it, tell me the whole story that sits with it. That's yours. It shouldn't be done in comparison to somebody else or what other people. And I interviewed Bronnie Ware, who wrote a fabulous book called The 5 Regrets of the Dying. The number one regret she talked about, and she was a lady who in Melbourne sat bedside with people who are about to die. And she said, your job is to be with people in their final hours, days, or weeks. There's no time for small talk. And she said the number one regret was, I never lived to my true ability. I never lived to my expectations. I always tried to please other people. I was never true to my own dreams. And so the first step, Simon, is to know, well, what is that dream that's yours? And it's not what you think you can do. It's what do you want? They're two separate things. The next thing is, once you've got that dream, write about it, draw a storyboard, journal about it, and then go back to, what am I going to do today to get there? Break it down into small pieces, what you can control. But I think the other thing is, you've got to keep going back to it. You've got to keep going back. When you feel as though you've lost emojis, go back to fundamentals. What's the dream? What am I doing right now? What can I control? What can't I control? What's important to me? What am I going to focus on? So it's kind of it all sits in a bit of a...
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming in. I think you might have actually answered this first one, but let's dive into it a little bit more. This one's from Clive Lewis. The anticipated and dreaded second wave applies to Mojo as well. I like that. How do we keep refinding our Mojo when we lose it for a second or third time?
Yeah. So the important thing is taking the time. So the second wave is the second arrow. There could even be a third arrow. So when that happens, know it's likely to happen, and it's okay. So when you talk to psychoanalysts, psychologists, people who work with mindset of people who are struggling, the first thing they'll say is just acknowledge it. Don't fight it. Don't resist it. Just acknowledge it. If you're feeling uncomfortable about it, acknowledge it. Then I would step back and even write about it, journal in your own journal about, what am I feeling uncomfortable about? Then you've got to readjust and go, the second wave is happening. What is the impact on me? What can I control? What can't I control? You may have to adjust and pivot, because we know all combat is a game of creativity, and that's where the thinking comes into it. Being inside your own mind is actually a good thing, because you've got the ability then to think through these things as opposed to just reacting, which is the second arrow. And to Clive's point, if you've gone day to day and you're starting to come out of that and you can see the dream for the future, if that dream is compelling enough, you might have taken off ramp, but you will still move towards that dream. Elon Musk is going to Mars. And there's a fabulous book here that I've got of Elon Musk that if anybody hasn't read it, this is an incredible book about a guy who built the dream before he even had gone to university. He knew he wanted to go to Mars in a spaceship. Now, with the pandemic, first wave, second wave, third wave, it's just a blip. He's not bouncing back, because that's bouncing back to where you were. He's just taking off ramp, had to close down for a while. Now he's back on the path again. So I think regardless of the waves, we've got to change our mindset, how we see that. It's just another challenge. But the other thing is that the challenge during this period is what builds character and builds grit and resilience. And if Clive is a leader of an organization with these waves coming through, how he reacts will set the tone for the company. If Clive is lucky enough to be a dad in a household, he's going to set the tone for the household. Readjust. But control the controllables, break it down, may have to take an off-ramp, and then go again.
Yeah, and we've got another question that's sort of related to this. Priya Gopi is saying, the running analogy is good. I use process goals and outcome goals. It's tough when the goal is removed, such as running a marathon. I've done virtual runs alone and misses the park run. So she misses the social element. My question is, how do you keep motivated until next year when races are back? So you've found the small bits, but is there a longer term motivation, do you think?
We know it'll come back. In whatever form, it will come back. I work with a guy who is one of the world's leading event designers. So he works with all these events to design them, to design the experience. And he told me, to her point, is that there are people who are doing virtual Ironman. Now, maybe not the swim, but certainly the bike and the run is being done in the home now in competition. It could become a thing. So I think it's understanding you can't control the Berlin or Paris or Auckland or Sydney marathon running. We can't control that. Chances are this too will pass and it'll come back in whatever form. But given that, what can you control? What you can control is your own fitness and how you do it with yourself. But number two then is, I think the question is, how do you then creatively create the community that you're used to having when you're running or training together on the track or on the road? How do you get back to that? And that's the second arrow where I know the impact it's having. I've got to step back from it and say, is there another way to do this? You guys are no different. The marathon is your live event at Lord's. And you could have gone, we're not going to be able to do it. We might as well just shut down for a while. But you went, there's another way to do it. And you've now got a community of people around the world who are joining us tonight to hopefully get some value from this. I think it's the same thing. And it wasn't until you thought before the second arrow to go, okay, well, we can't control that, but what can we control? What's the outcome we want? And how can we be of service to others?
So there are still more questions coming in, but I know you've got so much to share with us. Should we carry on, and I'll come back with some more of these questions shortly?
Yes, sure. So there was a Tibetan monk said, people everywhere try so hard to make the world better. The intentions are admirable, yet they seek to change everything but themselves. To make yourself a better person is to make the world a better place. What I want to spend a few moments on is the things that we can think about ourselves that we can control in order to get our own mojo back. If you work in, let's just take the example from the marathon situation, that requires creative thinking. There are people doing it. There are some amazing stories of people in the wellness and fitness industry who are creating new technologies for community and for wellness. But for you to design how you might go and solve that problem for the smallest possible way, right through to a completely new piece of software or hardware, creative outputs need creative inputs. And during this period, this is an amazing opportunity for us to get all new creative inputs to help us with creative outputs. My question for all of us is, what are we doing to increase our learning through this period when we have events like this? Tops. We have podcasts, we have books, we have great movies to access on Netflix, we have all this amazing repository. But when you lose your mojo, one of the greatest things you can do is to sit down and look for those that have gone before us to take the great learnings, because these sorts of things have happened in the past. We can take learnings from the Stoics. We can take it from the great presidents or prime ministers. We can take it from the great writers, the artists. And sadly, I don't know that enough of us are using this time to enhance our own learning. And your learnings will then make you a better problem solver from things like how do you do the marathon? How do you prepare for a second wave? How do we take this back to business? How do we help our teams? The other thing that I think goes with this, Simon, which is really important, is how are you curating your learnings? Because people during this period where they lose their mojo will seek any podcast. I need the next video. I need the next webinar. I need the next. What we're not doing is curating our learnings to take the best from the best and build it into a repository. And I think this is a really critical part of what we're doing, is that when we go through these things, it's like keeping a wonderful recipe book that we go through, we consume all these different recipes, but there's got to be a repository of our favorite recipes that are the go-to. Your nana, your grandnana had these great repositories of big books. It's that sort of stuff with our learnings. And during this time we lose our mojo, to get it back again, reading, learning, being inspired, taking that stuff and turning to knowledge, it's no longer any good just to consume it. The next webinar, the next this, the next that. It's about taking value from it, putting it somewhere that you can use it as a repository, then going and sharing with somebody else, which we'll talk about in a second, sharing with somebody else. Then that consumption becomes knowledge. When you do that long enough, then it becomes wisdom. So with the questions we're getting from people, those repositories, they'll be the wise ones that other people are going to and saying, hey, we're going through this thing. It's been going on for years now, but you just seem so happy. You just seem so together. There's so much vitality and zest. You've got your mojo working. How are you doing it? Think about what you're learning. Think about how you're curating your learnings. And the other thing that sits with this is, what are you learning in terms of hobbies, new skills during this period? Because this too will pass in whatever form, and you will end up getting back into some sort of workspace and or problem-solving space. If you are learning language, if you're learning new recipes, if you're learning guitar, if you're learning to sing, if you're learning how to fix your car, whatever it may be, all that time you're spending doing that will make you a better problem solver when problems like the ones we're talking about tonight are raised. Learning great skills and learning to be creative away from work helps you be a better problem solver at work. And if you're a parent, let me tell you, the greatest thing you can do is be an inspiration for your children when they see you with books. They see you with a journal taking notes. You are sharing things with them that you have read and seen. And particularly if they see you with a hobby, with something which is stretching your imagination, stretching your mind, it makes you not only much more interesting, you're an inspiration to those around you, and you become much more engaging when you find yourself in a situation talking to others. Being creative is the stepping stone to actual creative thinking. People who lose their mojo quite often, they forget to move. They actually forget to learn. They forget to pick up their guitar that's under the bed. Those are the things that make it just give us our mojo, make us feel really good. Joe DeSena, who started Spartan Race, which is now done by a bajillion people around the world, this whole Spartan racing thing is massive. He did an article just last week that I saw saying how many high-performing people are now walking. It's been done by the Romans. Steve Jobs did it, walking around the campus at Cupertino. But it's now a thing. As part of the pandemic, walking has become a thing, yet the great philosophers would solve their great problems by walking. So the other thing and these are to-dos you can think about. What are you reading or learning to stretch your brain? Where's your repository for great ideas? Is it in Evernote? Is it in a spreadsheet? Is it in a journal? Is it written somewhere? What are you doing to be creative, to enhance your creative thinking that also brings you joy, that makes you feel good, where you can experiment? These are some of the things that we forget to do when we get under pressure and lose our mojo and get too caught up in our own heads with the wrong stuff going around. And movement is a big part of it, just moving. Now, the easiest way to do this is to build it into your evening or morning rituals. Now, I love rituals, and the reason they're so powerful is because a ritual is a prescribed set of things you do in a prescribed order to take you to a set outcome. So you wake up in the morning, you do this, then you do that, then you do this, and then you do that. And what's really interesting, going back to the learning, is if learning is so important to us and we love reading and absorbing new information so much, why do we leave it to the last thing at night when we're about to go to sleep and we're the tiredest we're going to be in a day and about to recover? Why do we leave our learning to the last thing we do when we're probably mentally fatigued? It's an interesting question. So many people now in their morning routine will wake up and read, absorb stories, journal, walk, coffee, very important part of it. But you build these rituals. Now, the other part of rituals, which is really good, is that rituals help you inform what you will do, but they also inform what you won't do. So if there's things you don't want in your world, by having a really compelling routine or ritual in the morning, it takes out the stuff you don't want to do, particularly at night when 6 out of 10 people don't sleep very well. So if you feel as though you've lost your mojo, the best thing you can do is get a good night's sleep. Honestly, sleeping is so underrated, yet it's in the top 3, if not top 2 things for your wellness, health, mental clarity, weight loss. So think about your wind down routine at night where devices are off for 2 hours before you go to bed, nice warm bath, room's nice and cool, block out curtains, reading a book, going through that routine every night, because that helps you wind down and get a good night's sleep. And honestly, for most people, even a good night's sleep will help get your mojo back. So these are things you can tick off. And a ritual can be simply getting up in the morning, having a cup of tea, and going sitting on a bench. Don't make it complicated. Don't make it 27 steps and make it integrated so you have to write it down in a journal just to remember it. Make it easy. But it's the stuff that takes you to a place where you can sit, think, ponder, and do what's important to you with intention. But it also helps you inform the stuff that you don't want to do that could be distracting you and taking you to stuff that you can't control. And the last little bit before I throw it back to you, mate, is we mentioned this before, but people who lose their mojo quite often don't have a dream for the future. They don't have built-in time to reflect, which is part of your rituals and routines. And the other thing is they're so focused on the next marathon, the next thing, they're not grateful for the fact that they actually got the chance to put on a nice pair of shoes and run it all. And gratitude, if I was going to give people the easiest thing to get your mojo back right after you finish this, is sit down and go, what are you grateful for? And if you are on a nice computer, a laptop, an iPad, you should be grateful because there's a lot of people in the world who don't. If you've got the opportunity to sit here with these guys put on a great event for you, be grateful for it. If you can leave this, go home tonight to someone who loves you, whether it be a dog, a cat, or someone who loves you, be grateful for it. And there are a lot of people right now who would swap places with you in an actual heartbeat, who are in hospital in the ICU on a ventilator, who have lost their mojo and they're fighting for life. Their dream is to get to tomorrow. So that's the extreme of all this. But reflection, gratitude, dreaming is all stuff we can do. And quite often it's the simplest things. When I work with people who lost their mojo, you start going through these things, they go, yeah, I'm not doing it.
Brilliant stuff.
Questions, mate? What do you got?
Yeah, I've got quite a few questions coming in. Let's have a look. So this one's from Sol Phillips. How do I help other people, or how do you help other people around you get their mojo back?
So I'm going to segue. Thank you, Sol, because the other thing that I think is a key point that I've proved to myself, that if you want to get your mojo working, be of service to somebody else. Now, that simply can be, and I've done this over the last couple of weeks, and this actual event came to mind because I was thinking of Richard Chase a couple of weeks ago, and I sent him a 3-letter line saying, hey, man, how you doing over there? How are things? Love to know what you're up to. And Richard said, let's Zoom. It's really interesting, Sol, that all the stuff I've talked about, you can almost do like a therapist sitting in front of somebody to ask these questions. But rather than trying to tell them what to do, ask questions as a curious person who actually listens to draw it out of people. Where are they right now? They're living day to day. What are you thinking about? What are you focused on? What's going through your mind? Are you controlling the controllables, or is their mind on stuff you can't control? What hobbies should they be picking up? What are they interested in? What stuff are they doing? All the stuff I've talked about, you can build a checklist, which I'll show you in a second, to go through with other people. So I think sitting with somebody, one of the greatest things we can do, and this is really sad, but it's being proven around the world, that what kids read right now, what people need right now, is someone to pay attention. Because we sit in front of people's soul and we're on a device. So we say, hey, you been, man? Yeah, right. Not even look at them. Attention, if you want to help somebody who's lost their mojo right now, and you don't have to be face-to-face, you can be on a telephone, you can even do, I prove it through email, just by reaching out to somebody with a nice email and saying, how are you doing? I'd love to hear what you're up to. I've been astonished by the replies I get. It's absolutely astonished. For me, the first thing is, if you want to help somebody else, you just want to become a good listener and ask open-ended questions. And as Michelle Obama said in that brilliant documentary called Becoming on Netflix right now, she's signing books and there are 1,000 people in line. And she said, every person comes up, I look them in the eye, I ask about their story, I don't look beyond them, I don't look away, I just look at them. And I went, that is absolute gold. And for those people in America, the Garth Brooks, he's a country music star, one of the biggest selling artists of all time. He said, when you shake a person's hand and you look at them, you are saying to them how much you care and how interested you are in that person. That sort of stuff today, Sol, is the easiest way to help somebody get their mojo working, because they know you care. And ask open-ended questions. The other part of it that leads me on to is one of the best things I have done in the last decade was to volunteer. And I'm a deputy captain of our local fire brigade. That was me one night about 2 o'clock in the morning during the Australian bushfires just this season in January. That was us out with the crew fighting it. No one's getting paid. Everybody's tired. It's hard goddamn work. It's the best thing I have ever done, because people are coalescing around a mission. They're all volunteering. They're all clear. They're all putting themselves on the line. And that cup of tea after a big, big day or night, being of service to save some other farmer's property that you don't even know, I think is the wonderful way to get your mojo working, to feel fulfillment, to be grateful, to pat someone next to you on the shoulder. And it doesn't have to be as extreme as going out and being a first responder. You can do it by making somebody a cake. You can do it by dropping something to someone's house down the road, by dropping something on their steps, some baked goods or some kombucha, whatever it may be. But it's that being of service to somebody else. It just makes you feel good. You go home feeling satisfied. And it's such a wonderful thing to show our children that we are being of service to somebody else, because it just makes you feel good. That stuff gets your mojo going. And they may then decide to pass it on and pay it forward to somebody else and gets their mojo going. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. The classic story of that is I met a major, Martina Jewell. I did a speaking gig with her in Queensland last year. This was a lady who'd won 8 medals of honor in the Australian Army, and she served in the Peace Corps in the Lebanon border, and she got blown up by a bomb, and she was forced, basically the bomb blew up, broke her back. She was forced out of the army. And she was newly married. So she goes home and she's basically lying on a bed for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, and she can't be of service in the military anymore. And I said to her, how did you get through that period? Because she went through a severe depression. I said, how did you get through that? She said, Gary, one day I woke up and she said, I need a new mission. Because when you're in the military, the first responders, it's very clear what your mission is. And you get everybody aligned around a mission. She said, I knew I had to find a new mission for the day. And I decided I would iron my husband's shirt. That was it. There was a mission for that. But once she ironed his shirt, he went to work. She said, so tomorrow I'm going to iron 2 shirts. And that's how it begins. By helping somebody else, even the smallest possible thing. So if Saul's got somebody, you can be in front of them. If you are with them and focused on them having the conversation and being true to it, that's the first part. The second part is, if that is not possible, be of service to somebody else online, in person, do something for someone else, find the mission, because the mission is the thing that helps you get over those road bumps. When the second wave comes, I know what my mission is. I know what the end destination is. These are the things that keep your mojo going. You've got something of interest. It's fun and enjoyable. You're reading, you're curating your learnings, you are writing, you're journaling, you're grateful. Put all these things into a checklist, and I promise you, you'll start to feel better about yourself and the world around you.
We've got another question here, this one from Ian McKenzie, and it's got quite a lot of votes on it, so it's quite a popular one. What about imposter syndrome? So the voices in our head that say you can't do it, even when you know what to do. So how do we tackle imposter syndrome? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, it's really interesting. This is a true story. I spoke to a lady called Jackie Fury, who's a psychoanalyst, about the imposter syndrome. And she said, you know, Gary, when you sit with the best friend and your best friend's going through all these things about the imposter syndrome, I can't do this, I can't do that, what would you say to your best friend? You go, well, why do you believe that? You've done these things before. You've actually, look at what you've achieved in your life. Look what you're grateful for. Look at what people have said about you. Think about all the emails you receive or whatever it may be. But we don't do it to ourselves. We give advice to our best friend, yet our harshest critic is ourselves. It's really quite odd that you would sit with a friend and go through it and say, hey, come on, man, you know, what's the mission? Where do you want to go to? Why would you believe that? You're a terrific person. But we look in the mirror and we're our own harshest critic. The second thing is, and this sounds a bit odd, but you've almost got to step away from yourself and look back at yourself to go, what am I saying? What's the dialogue? Why would I choose to believe that? What evidence do I have to believe that? And this is something I go through all the time. Because when you're doing this sort of thing, and I'm into a camera with people in Denmark, Turkey, South Africa, people around Australia, Aussies, Ireland, I saw one from France come up. Man, you talk about imposter syndrome? But you've almost got to think about it. Now, when I wrote Who Stole My Mojo, I called them the Fat Bastards because Fat Bastards stole Austin Powers' mojo. And it is that voice inside your head. And it can be controlled because even Bono, the lead singer of U2, said backstage at Slane Castle, when you're the lead singer of a band like this, you walk on stage every night. It's like a boxer going to the ring and your opponent is yourself. And you hope on any given night your best self wins. So the thing is, the imposter syndrome, no matter who you talk to, never goes away. But what you've got to do is almost step away from yourself and question yourself, why would I believe that? Why am I saying this to myself? What's a more empowering voice to say? Elite performers make that voice so much louder than this negative voice. And any sports performance coach will be there to edit those voices. Now, we don't have, in a lot of cases, sports performance coaches, but what we can do is step away from ourselves. And if I was going to give you a tip of how to do it, I met with Lane Beachley. Now, Lane Beachley, for the Australians listening, will know Lane Beachley, one of our greatest ever sports people ever. She won 7 world championships in surfing. This was a girl who woke up every morning for 6 months wanting to take her life as a world champion. And I said to her, when you get those dark voices before you go into a world championship to go on the surf, when you get those dark voices, what do you do? That imposter syndrome, what do you do? She said, I grab my journal, I write them all down so I can see them all. And I can deal with them before I go in the water. Kelly Slater, the other mega 11, 12, 100-time world champion surfer, who I spoke to Lane about, he said, I sit on the beach, I look out the waves, and if I see any no's, I don't go in the water. I don't go in the water until I can see all yeses. So I think the thing for me is you've got to edit those voices in whatever way you do them, either in a journal or just talking to yourself, having a conversation with yourself in the mirror, but find the evidence. And quite often these things aren't based on evidence. And what you've got to be really careful is that this is what you're an expert in, Simon, is you don't carry those voices of what someone said to you 10, 20, 30 years ago. You carry that voice today, and that becomes your identity, which we're about to talk about. And there's all these things wrap into it, and quite often you can find that story that you believe from all that time ago, you're still carrying with you. And that's a self-propagating thing. If you're not exercising if you're not learning, if you're not sleeping well, if you're not eating well, if you're not doing all these things, it makes it much harder to control that imposter syndrome, because you get the fogginess in your mind, which is something Dr. Walls talked about. You get this fog, you don't get the clarity of thought, you don't have the confidence coming from your gut. So all these things all tie into each other. But the imposter syndrome, everybody has it, everybody deals with it. It can be dealt with. But you got to step back from it, and you got to edit that voice and edit that thing. Writing it down for a lot of us, because we're visual, really helps.
I so agree, and it's so fascinating. I do a lot of story work with like world-class athletes, Olympians, and I cannot count the number of times where I'm listening to their story, trying to shape it, and they don't believe that their story has value and it is significant enough. So even people at that elite athlete level have imposter syndrome. It's something we all need to tackle. Let's take one more question before we go on to the next section. So this one from Jay Carlin. Hi, Gary, he says. What do you look for from those who support you to achieve your goals? Is there anything specific that has been a real game changer for you? So support from others.
I think this is a really good question, Jay. And I would say that, and you hear this, you need someone who will give you the good and be a cheerleader. So here's my example, Jay. I want somebody who's going to be a corner man. Now, if you're a boxer, you want a corner man. You want Mickey, Rocky's Mickey. And if things are going good, Mickey's so happy for you. He's in your corner. He's making you feel good. Finish it off. You've done good. Well done. But you also want a corner man that things aren't going good to be able to give it to you straight with love and care to what you need to do to readdress it. And when I work with people, quite often I'm the corner man for them. And they say to me, we don't want you to be just all nice and bells and whistles, everything great. We want you to pull us into line. People want accountability, but you've got to do it coming from the right place. You've got to celebrate the good times. You've got to find a corner man or a corner person who will celebrate the good times. And if things aren't good, we'll do it with the right respect, with the right desire, with the right care, with the right attention, because they know what you're capable of and they believe it. And sometimes you don't even believe it, but they know what you're capable of and they care about you. If you have 5 of those cornermen, you're a lucky person to really have them, because you don't want a corner man who's going to be competing with you or comparing you or doubting you. You may stay friends, but they're just not going to be a corner man. You want that person who, when you're doing good, will be on your side. When you're not doing good, will pull you up, listen to the language, listen to what you're focused on. Are you being intentional with your thoughts? Go back and run the routines, run the rituals. What are you doing in your day? What are you talking about? They can hear it in your language. But they also know what the dream is, and they know you're capable of it. So I think it's a really interesting area. You've got to be very careful with who you have around you. It doesn't mean that everybody around you has to be like that. If you go back to the imposter syndrome, the problem we have is we listen to a lot of people who don't want us to succeed, or when things go to shit, they're actually happy to hear it because it makes them feel good about their lot because they're not doing it. So I think having a really good corner man is the critical part. And this word authentic or true self that's been thrown around, I just don't believe it. I just want someone who's going to say, you know what, if we're doing good, I want you in my corner. Things are going great. Let's celebrate together. If they're not, pull me up, do it with care, do it with genuine desire to help and be there to help if need be. But they also know what they at the top of the mountain is. And they know what your mission is. It's all these things threaded together.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's keep going, and then we've got a few more questions to answer, and we've got about 30 minutes left. So if you keep going, and then we'll have another break for questions in a short while.
So this is probably the most important thing I wanted to raise tonight. I've left a little bit of time for this. All change in the world comes from discomfort. This pandemic has made all of us really uncomfortable. But in that time, having your mojo working is embracing the fact that you feel uncomfortable, because that's where your growth's going to come from. There is so much has been forced on us as companies and as individuals, as families, and there's going to be a lot of good is actually going to come from it, but it was forced upon us. Grit is getting up time and time and time and time again. We're in a place right now in our world where we really lack resilience, we really lack grit. Yet it's in that place that all growth can come from. And what we need to think about is, how are we embracing discomfort in our learning by trying and learning new things? It can come from physical things, perhaps. It can come from emotional conversations we need to have. But think about these sorts of things to say because learning to deal with discomfort, learning to be resilient, and learning to have grit is a learned process. And if you're lucky enough to have a parent or have the influence over kids as a footy coach or a dancing coach or an instructor or a music instructor, our job is to help these children prepare for the future. They're looking at you as their superhero to lead by example. And the more you step into discomfort, you can do it in the smallest possible way, by finishing this thing tonight and doing 20 push-ups, which you wouldn't normally do, by running up to the letterbox and back in, or running around the block and stretching yourself tomorrow with an extra 500 meters, by having that difficult conversation, by talking to somebody who you haven't spoken to in 10 years and you kind of feel a bit embarrassed. It's discomfort, but it stretches you. And once you've done that, the next thing seems a lot easier. If you are sitting there telling me all the reasons that you can't do any of this stuff, if you fight hard enough for your limitations, I promise you they will be yours. And that's what I find the most when I work with people is, mate, go ahead, tell me all the reasons you can't. Because the more you fight for it, the more it will be yours, I promise you. But you can teach yourself to embrace discomfort. And during this period, and this thing, Simon and I were talking about this before, it's going to go on. This pandemic is going to go on for a while. It's, even in Australia right now, it's going through the second phase, which is actually worse than the first phase. But those that embrace it go back to the fundamentals we've talked about tonight. Go back to fundamentals and go, you know what? It's okay, because from this I will grow. From this, I'll be able to help those around me to grow, help my community to grow, help my children grow, my footy team grow. But all the limitations you're fighting for, I promise you, fight hard enough, they will be yours. But you can train yourself to do this by finding things that are uncomfortable, stepping into them, doing them. As Simon said before, celebrate those little wins, then take on something more difficult. Before you know it, you will be doing things that you will be surprising yourself that you could do. And it's interesting, if you talk to maybe people in Australia who go to the airport or a tube station in London, or somewhere there's a set of stairs and right next was an escalator. Next time you go, before you jump on, that's the first arrow, the second arrow, just sit back and watch, just for 5 minutes, and count how many people take the stairs and how many take the escalator. Because that's an example of the steps is discomfort. It's comfortable to take the escalator. That's the most simplistic, easiest way to think about. Be the person who takes the stairs. Because once you start doing that, you build an identity of the person who is comfortable being uncomfortable. And getting your mojo back when things don't go your way, or the second wave, the third wave that comes through, you go, I got this, because I'm the sort of person who takes the steps. I'm the sort of person who gets uncomfortable and relishes it. And I grow from it. This guy here is really interesting. He discovered, this is a guy who discovered what they call the iWriter. It's a $20 iWriter. His name's David Petrino. He now lives in LA. He's an Australian guy from, I think, Western Australia. And this iWriter is a thing that people who are completely paralyzed can use a computer just with their eyes. Just by moving their eyes, they can use a computer. It's insanely good. And I said, and he's taking on the world's biggest medical problems and finding solutions with his team. I said, what sort of mindset does it take for you to be able to do that? And he said to me, quote unquote, Gary, I chase hard things. His identity is built around the fact that he believes in himself. He chases hard things. And so I think the part of this is, if you go through and say, how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as being someone who struggles in hard times, can't come out of it, is distracted, can't get out of bed in the morning, doesn't like to exercise, because when you fight for those limitations, your brain finds all the evidence to back it up. This lady here is Patty McCord, who was the first employee at Netflix. And when Reed Hastings interviewed her, she came out of Silicon Valley. She was used to working with engineers. She said, I'm not a HR person, I'm an engineer, because I've come out of Silicon Valley where you're always dealing with engineers. So her belief from that is that she likes to test things. She never does things the same way as everybody else. And once she tests it, she wants data to back it up. So she sees herself as an engineer. How do you see yourself? And identity has been such a massive piece through our show, our Mojo radio show podcast, the last maybe 3 to 4 seasons of High Performers, is a lot of it comes back to where they lost their mojo was how they saw themselves. When they changed their identity and how they saw themselves, they found their mojo. Anybody who lives in America may know Jenny Britton Bauer, who runs Jenny's Splendid Ice Creams. Amazing ice creams. She doesn't see herself as an entrepreneur or a business leader. She sees herself as being a scientist. And she's changed the whole artisan game of ice cream in America. She doesn't see herself as being a typical entrepreneur or business person. She sees herself as being a scientist. Once you know how you see yourself, all your habits are then reinforced because your habits back up your identity. MasterChef is on here in Australia. The Australian version of MasterChef is seen in 180 countries around the world. It's the most successful cooking show in the world, the Australian version. And I met this guy called Dan Churchill, who's now got Charlie Street Restaurant in New York. He's on American television all the time. He's got a number of books. He's about to do a documentary. And I said, you didn't even win MasterChef. You get kicked out and you were number 6. How did you use that to create such success? And he said, I knew there'd come a point where I would be eliminated. So at nighttime in the MasterChef house, I started writing a cookbook and I decided I'd be the healthy chef. So when he got eliminated, went on breakfast television the next morning, I said, Dan, what are you going to do now? He said, I'm Dan Churchill, the healthy chef. Everything Dan does, he's a good-looking rooster. He works out. Charlie Street's about healthy food. His book's about healthy food. It's all he talks about in his publicity. Every podcast he does, he talks about being the healthy chef. Identity, and this goes back to what you talked about, Simon, is informed by the stories you tell yourself. But this is a classic tool we could use to get our mojo working. And I would challenge each of us on this call tonight to say, how do you see yourself? But different for me, mate. I'm a financial advisor, and it's different for me. I had one of these calls, did this session. This guy said, I don't see myself as a financial advisor. I'm the navigator because I'm a yachty. I enjoy the water, and I navigate the problems people have with their finances. I met a guy just last week, and he said, I've got 4 children. I see myself as being Mr. Brady from the Brady Bunch. That's how I see my identity, as being a dad. But he said, can you have multiple identities? And I said, absolutely, depending on the circumstance. He said, because I do martial arts and I see myself in business as being the fighter. And yet he plays in a band and he sees himself and calls himself the identity of being the conductor. So you can have different identities for different parts of what you do in your world. But the identity then informs all the behaviors that come after it. And this book here, I would recommend as being one of the great reads for you guys to reinforce this, by James Clear. I interviewed James Clear live at Bondi Beach on the Mojo radio show during summer of 2019. And one of the things that really resonated with me out of this book, and this book is about creating great habits, is that it's not the habit, it's the identity that sits in front of that. Get the identity right, that informs all the habits. So if you see yourself as a person who has mojo, who's being resilient, who is gritty, who finds themselves embracing discomfort, and it's just a stepping stone, then what happens is all the behaviors that follow that will reinforce that identity. And so think about this. If you're interested, I'll give you a reading list of my favorite books for the last little while before we finish. But there's something Bedros Keuilian said. He said, people do not decide their future. They decide their habits. And their habits decide their future. So think about habitually what you do each day, because a lot of that will come from the stories you tell yourself, which will come from the identity of how you see yourself. So I think it's a really critical part, Simon. I wanted to get that in before we wrapped up. But it may take a couple of questions, and then I will try and bring the shindig together.
Yeah, sure. So we've got a few more questions here. So Daniel Hinsley saying, if you've ever watched X Factor, you've seen that people clearly visualize themselves as, a famous pop star. They've practiced and practiced. They've opened their mouths, and then they're dreadful singers. What is your view on how to set the right goals and visions? So, goals and visions that are, I guess, realistic.
There's a lot to that, and I think the same thing myself. You often get people up there who think they've done the practice, think they've done all the work, get up there, open their mouth, and someone will say, have you ever had lessons? No. You get those people who open their mouth up and they're good, but they don't get through, who then go and spend a whole year busking on the street in train stations, face to face with an audience, and have a vocal coach who come back and then make it through to the final 10. So there are a couple of things with it I'd say is, number one, the dream is fine. The dream is absolutely perfect. And the other thing, that you can have a dream, and what happens is, the curious thing is, you step towards that dream, you may not hit that dream, but you may hit another dream that's informed because you had a crack at that one. That can happen also. I may not get to Wimbledon, but now I get to work as their marketing manager. But had I not had that dream, I would never have gotten there in the first place. So I think there's nothing wrong with that. Number two is, you've got to do the work. It goes back to the marathon. Is you can have the dream, and you've got to believe in it, but then you've got to go back and get a coach, buy the books, look at some videos, but you've got to buy a pair of running shoes and do the miles. And you go back to what we talked about before, is then you've also got to have someone in your corner who's with you, who's doing it for the right reasons, who says, yeah, go for that, holding you accountable to the work, but at some point had that conversation to say, look, you should chase your dream. You may not get there. You may want to think about it. Now, the challenge is, if you have a fallback plan, you plan to fall back. So there is a very fine line between all these things. The other part of it, Simon, is that if someone has a crack at that, if they say they do the work, they do open their mouth and they're not very good, those things normally don't sit together. What they think was work, singing to their friends who go, you are amazing, is not really doing the work. If they have a crack at that dream and it doesn't work, quite often that can open up the door for a reality of what could be a great dream. It's a delicate one, but I would say encourage them to have the dream, but then you've got to get down, you've got to do the work, and you've got to bring in a lot of cases expertise to help you from outside, who can help you get to that point. But then you need people in the corner who can have an honest conversation if you've done the work and it's still not working, to talk about what other options are.
Great. There's about 3 more questions left. I'm going to save Debbie's question for last because I think it's such a good one. Let's go to Ali's question. Do you take a deliberate approach to learning? So let's come back to your points about curated learning, which I really loved. I particularly like the idea of curation in life and in learning. So Ali enjoys bouncing from one book to another on reference of the author. So it's varied and interesting, but sometimes wonder whether they should be more specific about learning objectives and outcomes. So what are your thoughts about that, about a more deliberate approach to learning?
I think a deliberate approach to learning, yes, I do. I personally believe in that. I believe in 2 parts to it. Was it Ali that asked the question?
Yes, it was, yeah.
So I think there's 2 parts to it. Number one is, Pat Flynn talks about being a generalist versus a specialist. And he said, the world is going to belong to the generalist, a person who has lots of knowledge of a wide variety of things. And in those things, it may get you into a position. But then what you want to do is become a specialist in something and deep dive into it 80%. You don't have to be the world's best or a complete expert in it. But what you do is you become a generalist, where we have, Simon and I were talking about technology tonight. You've got storytelling and technology, the stuff you want to do in the future. You've got all these things blending because you're a generalist. But then if you want to do interconnect and go into the next phase of the track, you may need to dig into this and become a specialist in an area to get very, very good at it. But at the same time, you're learning a different skill on the side to be a generalist. So should there be specific learning? Absolutely. At times you really want to dig into something to master it, to be very good at it. At the same time, I believe being deliberate with things. I love the library. I love the library because I can go in and I can grab 5 or 6 books at a time and take a chance. I love that because I go, I wouldn't normally have a crack at that and pay the money for it, but I can get it at the library. Why wouldn't I? Podcasts are great for that because you can listen to a podcast and there's no risk of finance or anything else. If you don't like it, you just piss it off. So I think being deliberate, first thing I'd say is be deliberate with your learning. Build it into your rituals. Don't leave it to the last thing at night when you're dead tired. Build a ritual. If I get on the tube, I read. I get on the tube, I sit down, put on my relaxation music or nothing, ambient music, I read or listen. So you can build rituals into your day and be very deliberate with your times of learning. Always carry a journal. Like you always have to have a journal and a pen with you so you can curate your learnings. I always carry one in my back pocket. I always have one in my backpack. So I always have 2 journals. I have one in the car. So I'm very deliberate with curating stuff that I then have a system to record it. Topics-wise, I'll find something I'm really interested in and I'll dig into it. Generalists versus specialists. Leadership right now. Mission is really important to me. So I'm digging into those things a lot. But at the same time, I'll find podcasts and books that I wouldn't normally probably go to. And that just takes me to places that I can probably find random stuff to bring into a conversation like this. So I'm very deliberate with when and how. Audiobooks I'm really into. I listen to an audiobook or 2 every month. I'm into hard copy books. I'm into Kindles. I experiment with them all. I don't have a problem with that. But I'm very deliberate with the curating of it, what I do with the learnings, how I use the learnings. But I'm also very open to someone going, hey, here's a book about permaculture. I go, I haven't really thought about that, but sure, why not?
Great. I was going to ask this one question, then I'll ask the last question, and then you can sort of take us out and you bring it all together for us.
You're building this one up, mate. It better be good.
So another question here from Clive Lewis. Interesting fact about Clive. Clive has been to every single one of Richard's events for the last 10 years. It must be. So that's what Richard tells me.
Wow.
So putting together
cool.
Cool. So putting together your piece about helping others, give them attention and ask open questions and be of service to others. With this piece, presumably the key question in helping others and ourselves is, who are you or how do you see yourself? Would you agree with that? Those are key questions.
Absolutely. Because I've always seen myself as, when I'm talking with somebody, meeting somebody, I always see myself as a journalist. And I think Michelle Obama does the same thing where she said, I don't look past somebody, I don't look around, I look at them, because hearing their story helps me make sense of the world. So I think, to Clive's point, is if you sit down with that identity of being an interviewer or being an interrogator or being someone who is a novelist who's trying to find the story of the person, who will ask questions in a question. You see the great interviewers, they'll throw a question out and they'll ask a question in the answer to keep the conversation flowing, as opposed to, So I think the identity, I can't tell you, it's such an interesting question from Clive, is that it's such a powerful piece to think about for our children, for people we work with. It's informed by our stories, how we see ourselves right now, because all the habits. So if you are a journalist, all the habits that follow are, you will ask more questions. You will dig in to find the thread. You'll want to know the backstory, how that came to be. And you'll be actually memorizing, recording it, because you've got to go and then share it with somebody else. So all the habits of that conversation are informed by, how do you see yourself? It's a really interesting premise.
Great. I couldn't agree more. That starting point of how do you see yourself and how do you then project that out into the world. So to that point, and to Debbie Green's question, thanks for this, Debbie. I really love it. And I think this will help you close us out. Is what has been the biggest thing that you've discovered about yourself during this time, during the pandemic?
Curation. Because I find that, I read 80, I think last year I had 85 books in the year. I'm on track to do the same thing this year. I listen to probably 10 to 15 hours of podcasts a week. So I'm getting a lot of stuff. But to Debbie's point, what I have found the last 2 months, particularly here in Australia, is then curating what's happening around the world to try and make sense of now against the stuff that I know that people are publishing, to say, how do you take that to meet this? How do you take what's happened in the pandemic to meet the Stoics? How do you take what whoever Naval Ravikant is saying and bring it right now? How is strategy from the great military parts of Reese and Trout or Sun Tzu, how does that apply to right now when I'm in a pandemic? I can't even think about that right now. So for me, the curation and piecing together the great learnings of all those who've gone around us and before us with, how do I use it right now to get my mojo working? What are the takeaways? And if I could give an example of that for us to take away right now, Simon, I'd say these are all bits that you can find from lots of different places. So control the controllables, break it down, creative inputs, curate learnings, having a hobby, moving, rituals, being of service, identity, being gritty, and then repeat. There's your checklist. So in 4 weeks' time, you go, man, I felt that call, I felt really good. Some of the stuff that Clive, everyone was saying, I felt really good, lost my mojo, go back to the checklist. But I find that a lot of this stuff is really relevant right now. It's even more relevant now if you can build stories into it. And a classic example is Dr. Wall's story of, I was living day to day, then I started to have a vision for the future. To me, that's absolute gold of curating a story about wellness and health that actually ties back to right now with the pandemic. We've all gone through it. So the biggest learning for me is even the curating and taking the time to think about, how do I add value to people around the world who give of their most precious commodity to add value to their world for themselves, their children, their community, their business, their teammates. So it's been really interesting. As much as I feel gutted for the people who have gone through hardship, are going through hardship, and the first responders having to deal with it, I think a lot of good will come from the pandemic, and I choose to look at the stuff that I think were the good outcomes. The challenge to everyone in this call is, take the stuff that's a good outcome from the pandemic. How do you keep it? Have the discipline to keep it in your world, as opposed to getting back to normal? Because already in the last 2 weeks here in Australia, people are late for calls, forgetting calls, distracted. They're on the phone talking to you, but they're also, you can hear them clicking on the computer. All the stuff we did prior pandemic that went away during the pandemic is now back to normal. The people I work with is, don't be normal. Don't be common. Be uncommon. And this is the checklist to go back to it.
Fantastic. We'll share that. We'll share that checklist out, Gary.
Yeah.
So, do you want to just wrap up, and then I'll say goodbye?
So, a couple of just real quick things. Heathrow Airport during pre-pandemic was one of the most busy airports in the world. But even Heathrow can only land one aircraft at a time. The biggest mistake we have is we try to do too many things all the time. Chris McChesney, who wrote The 4 Disciplines of Execution, said, you've only got a small window in your day to put in new incremental things. So you've got to take things out that are stealing your mojo, control the controllables, things that aren't aren't adding to the dream, don't make you feel good, aren't intentional things that you want in your world. Take those out to make room for good things to come in. From tonight's call or today's call, depending on where you are in the world, just pick out one thing. Just start with one thing and execute it. Because the problem today is we are consuming so much stuff, we're not curating it, and then we're not executing. So I hope there's been at least one thing you can take and execute from the list, which we'll give to you. I've talked about the Mojo radio show as the podcast I do on iTunes or Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, it's everywhere. All the things I've talked about tonight, you'll find guests talking and reiterating. It's all the stuff I've curated for tonight. So would anybody like a copy of the notes for today? Should we put a copy of the notes up?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got everyone's email address.
To pandemic, Gary Bertwistle, /pandemic Mojo, passwords Mojo1, and I will put them up and everybody can download them and have all the notes. So we'll make that available to everybody from all the slides from tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gary. I'll just close off. It's been great to see you again. I love the fact that throughout you've been saying night, and I keep looking out the window going, "Where's day?" Simple things. wait, but it's the morning here. I think it's brilliant that I think it's wonderful
I
that
can see night. I can see stars.
Yeah. I think it's wonderful that we've been able to do this. I mean, that's one of the things for me that the pandemic has provided, if that's the right thing to say, is this ability to bring a global audience together. And we know that the technology was there before, but we just weren't using it because we didn't think it was necessary, perhaps. And now we've got this opportunity delivered to us. We're actually making the most of it. And the other thing I would say about your points on curation, which really, really have struck home with me, is I think we can learn lessons from anywhere if we're open to the stories and we're listening effectively. So your point about a leader can take a lesson from history, some of the stuff that Richard and I are very, very keen on is hearing true stories, real stories from people in the strangest or smallest of places, because the leader or CEO of a business or in government could listen to that story and take a spark of an idea and carry it forward, and who knows where it could take them. So big thank you for your time today. We're super grateful for you being here. Good. Okay. Well, I shall say goodbye to you, and then I shall say goodbye to these people.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody. It's been an absolute privilege and honour. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. That's all we've got time for today. We'll be in touch soon about the next set of events. Who knows when they will be, but we will speak to you soon. Thanks for joining us, and thanks so much for your time.